think of doing as a composer because you just can't notate it. You can't do it in that particular chord. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Christian. A lot to think about right there. And Michael Parsons is our last presenter. And we'll have plenty of time for comments and questions from the audience.
So again, just casting around for some disconnected thoughts. I was particularly interested in something Mark said about incorrect readings or perverse readings of Beethoven's symphony, for example. Well, probably the supreme example of this would be the Portsmouth Sinfonia, whom some of you probably heard recordings of, or at least heard by reputation. The Portsmouth Sinfonia were a group of art students in the early 1970s at Portsmouth School of Art who formed an orchestra to play popular classics, but had very little previous experience of playing orchestral instruments. So they went around second-hand shops and picked up old battered saxophones and violins, and they listened to recordings of these works. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony was one of them. The I think Thieving Magpie Rossini Overture was one of them as well. William Tell Overture was the famous first one. And they just simply sat down with very little experience, but a huge amount of enthusiasm, and began to play these pieces by ear. Later on, they started to learn to read notation. They struggled very hard to learn notation as they went along, but they didn't wait until they could actually read it. They simply followed the graphic shape of the notation without being too much aware of the specific pitches. And they produced hilarious and exhilarating versions of these popular works, which absolutely brought the house down everywhere they played. And they became almost like pop stars. They played in the Albert Hall and places like that. And in this case, the notation, there was nothing different about the notation. That the indeterminacy lay in the performers themselves, in their lack of skill, and yet their deliberate attempt to play as well as possible. And one of the things about the Sinfonia was that they were always trying to play as accurately as they could under the circumstances and with the skills that they were in the process of acquiring. They never intended to be setting up the music or making a joke of it. They actually loved the music and they wanted to play it as well as they could. But of course they were misunderstood. It became commercialized as a kind of joke, sort of taken up by Spike Milligan and people like this. And they resisted that. But it's an interesting example of how music the meaning can be changed by the way that it's marketed and by the cultural assimilation that it undergoes. Another thought which comes from the English experimental music scene to do with what you might call perverse notations was a very ingenious interpretation of the art of fugue, which was devised by John White in the early 1970s. He had an ensemble of 4 percussion keyboard players called the PTO, which stood for Promenade Theatre Orchestra. And John worked out this way of performing the art of fugue in a 4-stave open score for the 4 players, each with 1 woodblock. And the interpretation consisted of playing a stroke on the woodblock for every accidental which appeared in the score. Now, if you look at the art of fugue, of course it begins, I think it's D minor, isn't it? It's got 1 flat. So the accidentals appear very gradually. So that like the first 15 bars or so, there aren't any accidentals. And then you might get a C sharp or a B natural or something, and then you'd hear the woodblock. And gradually, as the piece modulates into more remote keys, you get more and more of these accidentals. And that seemed to be an absolutely brilliant example of reinterpreting a traditional notation. So those are a few thoughts about that subject. several of you have mentioned working with children, and that reminds me of a Japanese composer I know called Nomura. I've forgotten what his first name is. Makoto Nomura. Does anybody know Makoto Nomura? He's done some absolutely brilliant work with children, in which he starts completely from scratch without them expecting to know anything at all. And by way of parenthesis, in response to Christian's account of learning musical notation at an early age, which must be the experience of very many of us, that we're expected to work out from the stave as we move our fingers. This has always seemed to me to be a very perverse way of teaching music to children. It's rather like expecting children to read before they can speak. Because after all, the first thing you learn to speak, and then later on you learn to read. But obviously, this method in music would be much more fruitful. You should allow children to explore the sounds first, and then later on they find out how the notation works. But Makoto Nomura had this, he was a student at York University in the 1970s doing the education course, and he was put into a school to work with a group of children. And the first thing he did was to say, in his very, very broken English, make noise, more noise. So he got them all banging their desks and sort of stamping around the room. No, more, louder. He just, the whole classroom just completely making as much noise as they could. And then he sort of looked around rather helplessly and said, how do we stop it? And then he got the children to themselves suggest ways in which this could be stopped. So he gave the children the problem of how to create silence. And that seems to be a great creative way of starting with children. So those are my thoughts for the moment.
That's fabulous, Michael. Thank you, all panelists. Much to think about here. We should open the floor for questions and comments and points of discussion. Now, Jane, are we bound to stop at 5:30? Could we go a little bit more?
Well, maybe just 5 minutes or so.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. Then it's quarter. So, questions, comments from the floor? Yes.
Many of you kind of spoke to this about the tension between how much or little time is spent with the score, and I know that that is probably very subjective and depends on the score, but kind of speaking to what Mark was saying about forbidding improv and kind of how much time you would expect your performers to look at your scores or think about your scores before they perform them.
Anybody want to take that one?
Well, it relates to what George Chambers was saying in one of his questions about withholding the score until the moment of performance, so that the performer is confronted with a completely unexpected situation which he or she has had no opportunity to prepare for. And by throwing them into this situation, as I understand it, you get some surprising and inventive response. And that's a strategy I've heard from other people as well. That you don't want too much preparation. You want to preserve that spontaneity. But in order to do that, then your score has to be able to communicate immediately through its visual presence.
I'd like to comment on that very briefly because I have an opposite take, which doesn't mean you can't do what you've just been talking about. But I have pieces in my repertoire that I have had for some time, and I've just mentioned two of them because I played them from time to time. One of them is the Cage songbooks, which are almost all solo pieces, but they're meant to be done in an ensemble situation. But I've come back to this many, many times over a period of since 1978, and it's like visiting an old friend of a Beethoven sonata or something. You find something new, it becomes part of you. The other piece, which I really recommend, and I wanted to mention this anyway because of Ron's comment about where the solo pieces of an extraordinary solo piece by a composer that people don't think of as writing graphic notation is the Walden Variations of Bill Duckworth, which is an extraordinarily beautiful piece, and he did. I don't want to describe it, but anyway, you can play it as a solo piece any length, and it always works.
I'd just like to mention something. I have a piece that I play on the piano that is that I wrote for myself as a tremendously virtuoso display of pyrotechnics. I mean, I just wanted to show off my facility. I'm just like all over all the registers, fast leaps, crazy things, nested toplets. I need a page turner for this piece because it's like I'm just like huffing and puffing and I'm nodding and everything like that, and I'm following this thing. Okay. Except that afterwards I reveal to the audience that it's an improvisation. And I actually use Brian Fahrenheit's lemma icon epigram as the score that I have in front of me, and I have a placebo page turner. So the interesting thing is the valence of its prestige, authority, cachet, and legitimacy inverts based on its context. So if I play that piece at Darmstadt, and then I reveal the game is up, and like that people understand what's happening, then the respectability drops, you know, because people are like, oh, you spent so much time practicing, rigorously working on this thing and all this gnarly stuff, and then it's like, oh, you just made that up. If I'm in some sort of like jazz club or something, some derivation of that kind of scene, then the prestige goes up because it's like people are kind of bored, like, oh, you couldn't make up something on the spot. So I think that there are different qualities to these things, and so for me, in the piece that I mentioned, I mean, I have a piece called The Metaphysics of Notation, which is this 72-foot long pictographic score that was in a museum for a year, and on Fridays from noon till 1, various players came in and interpreted it. Some camped out for, especially locals, for days and weeks, and they planned assiduously what they were going to do in response to it. And others came from far and wide, and they just had to have a more improvisational response, which I allowed anything in that particular piece. Eric Ullman, my colleague, who's an amazing violinist, it was local, but specifically wanted to have a completely spontaneous response. He actually wanted to be led in with his back to one of the panels, and so like at noon he turned around and just started. And these things have different qualities, and they're all welcome. My point in medium, and this is the reason why I mentioned it, is I wanted to have that, well, it sounds pejorative, but labored, kind of rigorous, spending time with the score response to it in this one case.
That was a great question. Sean.
So I was hearing various reactions to people that want more spontaneity and less spontaneity, and Mark, you seem to want both. I was just wondering if anyone can address how their backgrounds as musicians, either improvising musicians or non-improvising musicians, how that might have influenced you in a reactionary way or in a positive way towards being more in favor of spontaneity or more in favor of rigorous interpretation of these things.
Let me just quickly respond. I think that's a false dichotomy. It's possible to do a completely rigorous interpretation of a classical period piece where you change your whole concept right before you play. I've done it, I've seen it done. So that's just not the way it works, right? Spontaneity can happen in all sorts of forms. So I just think that's not the way to think about the relationship between improvisation. I mean,
maybe spontaneity is the wrong word, but there is something about like having a plan and having a certain sort of conceptual pre-formulating some sort of personal sense of fidelity to the enterprise, you know, in advance. But I think what you're talking about actually is that we can actually play, despite the fact that we have familiarity with something.
Well, but there's also that there's existing within the limitations of the structure, or not, right? But the question is, in improvisation, are you or are you not living within the limitations of the structure? And I think that's a highly, fraught issue. If you take that really seriously. I mean, certainly, great improvisers have changed their minds about that.